Welcome to Leveling Up Mental Health, another exciting episode with my best friend, Andrew Nicholson.
Hi there. I'm excited to be here with you, my best friend, Adolyn H.
I was so hesitant for a second there, thinking you weren't going to say best friend.
What if I didn't?
I would have heard me.
What if I said, I'm here with my close friend.
A friend.
I'm here with a friend.
A friend.
A good friend.
Yeah, but I would have had to kept the interview the whole time. It's just...
Yeah.
No, it's a good point, Andrew. No, just got something in my eye. That was just...
No, it's been established on this podcast. It's part of documented history now that we're best friends. So I can't even take it back.
We need to do
takes back.
We need to do a story arc where we break up our friendship.
Yeah.
So the audience he really follows along for the journey.
That's a good idea. It's like reality TV.
Exactly.
Are they going to get back together?
Will they? Won't they? Will they?
Yeah.
Won't they?
Yeah. We can start separate podcasts.
Yeah.
But then we'll come back together.
Yeah.
We'll have greater numbers than ever.
Oh my God.
That's such a good idea.
This is a great idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're excited for our guest on today's episode.
Yes, we are.
We have Derritt Mason on.
Mm-hmm.
They are an author and a professor at the University of Calgary, and they talk all about queer theory and queer representation in video games and some of the intersections with mental health themes represented in video games.
And a huge video gamer.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, taught us about games that we didn't know about, hadn't played, and so...
I can't believe there are games we don't know about.
I know. I'm a little bit embarrassed. We're going to have to...
That's what the winter break is for.
Yeah, they're on our Let's Play list.
Yeah, we need to do a training arc.
A Rocky training montage.
Yeah. We're just playing game after game after game.
Yeah. Good idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, without getting too far into it, we'll do our debrief afterwards. But let's get to the interview.
Let's do it.
Well, welcome to our guest on the episode today. We're very excited to have you. We have Derritt Mason, who's an author and a professor at the University of Calgary. Tell us and our viewers who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Any excuse to talk about games. I love it. So thrilled to have been invited. My name's Derritt Mason. I use they, he pronouns. I'm an associate professor of English at the University of Calgary. And my main areas of research and teaching are actually children's and young adult literature and gender and sexuality studies. But I also do some cultural and media studies stuff, which is where the video game work comes in. And that's something I've really been focusing on for the last 5 or so years. Maybe I'll just say briefly how I kind of got into video game studies.
Yeah.
I was working on my book, which is called Queer Anxieties of Young Adult Literature and Culture, and working on revisions for that book. And at the time, they had just announced that the first ever queer video game, which is called Caper in the Castro, had been kind of rediscovered and put back online for public play and public consumption.
Okay.
And so I got really excited about that and ended up writing about it in my book. And it was just so much fun that I was like, oh, you know what? I want to do more work about games and video games. And so my work primarily has been at the intersection of children's literature and video games. So thinking about how video games tell coming of age stories, but also I do some work with queer games, queer representation in games, and also queer game design. So.
Right.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
What an interesting transition from children's literature to video games. I'm curious, can you repeat the name of the game again?
Yeah, it's called Caper in the Castro.
Caper in the Castro.
Yeah.
And what kind of game is it? Like, how do you play
It's
it?
it's a hypercard, point and click, detective adventure game.
Oh, those are my favorite.
Yeah, you do love those.
They're like Nancy Drew.
Totally.
Yeah.
And you can play it.
Yeah.
If you it's on archive.org. And the creator, C.M. Ralph, created it as charityware in the late 80s to raise money for HIV/AIDS charities.
Interesting.
Yeah, and you play. It's actually quite funny. You play as a lesbian detective named Tracker McDyke, and what's happening is there's been a series of, or actually there's been a disappearance, a drag queen named Tessie LaFemme has been kidnapped.
Oh, no.
And you're tasked with solving the mystery of Tessie's disappearance.
Right.
And it turns out there's a conspiracy that's being run by someone named Dulligan Straight Man. I don't want to spoil too much, but essentially he's trying to poison the alcohol in the bars in the Castro district.
Can't happen.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
you have to kind of unpack that mystery and rescue Tessie from Dulligan Straight
Oh,
Man.
we're adding that to the list.
Yeah,
yeah.
we got to do a let's play of that.
that
That's
for
really
sure.
cool.
Yeah.
Not very subtle themes in there, is there?
No. Yeah, and I mean, what I talk about in the book is how the game actually, it doesn't mention HIV/AIDS at all, but the game kind of functions allegorically to tell a story about infection and death in the queer community, but with a lot of humor.
Right.
It's kind of an interesting artifact.
Yeah.
It's a bit crunchy, but it's fun to play. It's kind of glitchy too.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
fun to play.
But that's
Really
the charm,
interesting.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's the charm of the old games.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I imagine there probably weren't a lot of its kind in the late 80s.
No, this is kind of hailed as the first like video game with overt queer representation. There was another one that followed in the early 90s called Gay Blade, and there's a
No pun with Beyblade.
no. Actually, I had a student raise that, and I was like, I don't even know what Beyblade is, but then I looked into it. Yeah, and it's like a dungeon crawler RPG. There's a Netflix docuseries called High Score about video games. I'm not sure if you've watched that. It's really fantastic.
Okay.
It kind of gets, every episode is a little piece of video game history, and the one on role-playing games actually talks about Gay Blade, and they interview the creator, Ryan Best, and they also, like Caper and the Castro, thought this game was lost to history, but then turns out someone found it, and it's also been reinstated online. And the point of this game is to get through a series of dungeons to fight Pat Buchanan, who was like the conservative, like anti-gay at the time. So anyway, interesting kind of artifacts of queer game history.
Yeah. It's neat to hear about those, to know those exist, because I think a lot of times if you think about what are maybe the first queer representations in video games, I think many people might think more modern games, but to know, no, these things were being done back when it was less in vogue, less popular to have it represented.
And interesting too that they're kind of games as activism to a certain degree.
Yeah, that's a great point, because many games will throw in representation, but it almost either feels like an after conversation, or it's our lead is the queer representation, but that's it. The story has nothing to do with anything else, which has I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Maybe there's some pros and cons to both approaches, and are there any recent more activist type games that really are supporting?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. Nothing comes to mind, but you've really kind of like piqued my curiosity. And I'm thinking too at the time, just because of how games circulated, right? Because this is obviously like pre-internet in its current configuration. So these games had to circulate like kind of as shareware. I know that in High Score, Ryan Best talks about kind of having a phone line set up so that people could call in and like order the game by phone, and then you would ship it to them. And with Thiem Ralph, like they were exclusively kind of distributing the game as charityware amongst their kind of communities. So I think that part of the kind of activisty and almost zine-like circulation of games was a product of how games circulated kind of at the time. Yeah,
that makes sense.
But I think that there are a lot of indie developers working in queer gaming space who are doing really interesting things. The first person that comes to mind is Anna Anthropy, who's a trans queer game designer. I was going to also talk about one of her games today called Queers in Love at the End of the World, which I love. It's a 10-second game you can play online.
10 seconds?
Yeah, 10 seconds.
Okay.
There's also... I'm trying to think of the names of other folks right now. There's a scholar at the University of Alberta who is working on a trans game zine that will come out kind of monthly and be filled with kind of small mini games. PB Burge is their name at the University of Alberta. So it's definitely in the more kind of indie spaces. I'm trying to think of any like AAA games that would be considered activisty.
Yeah,
and
probably less likely.
less coming to
I
mind.
feel like
Yeah.
AAA games have to play it so safe now, and have to is maybe a subjective
Yeah.
term, but a lot of it would more be in the indie space. So what's your personal connection to video games? Did you grow up playing games, or how did you get into them?
I did grow up playing games. I'm of the Commodore 64 generation. So, I mean, my interest, I think, in games really started. I'm a child, like I was born in the very early 80s, and my dad was a junior high teacher, and he would always be able to bring computers home over the summer and over the winter holiday from school for me and my younger sister, who's 5 years younger than I am, to play with. And so it started with, like, he'd bring home those a pet computer. Do you remember those giant beige monstrosities with like the tiny screen that could only display green and black? And so he'd play like, games that would basically be based on ASCII characters, right? Like navigate a maze or things like that. Then we got a Commodore 64. Then, of course, because I was a kid in the mid 80s, I had to have a Nintendo, the original NES. So we were always kind of like a Nintendo family, but then, the computers that my dad brought home eventually got better and better. We'd get different kind of Mac computers. And I was really, as a kid, into the Sierra Online games, like the King's Quest and Space Quest franchises. And then when I think went off to university, I stopped playing games for a long time. And it's really only in the last kind of like 10 years that I've gotten really back into gaming. I discovered Stardew Valley. The like 8-bit aesthetic really brought out that kind of like those nostalgic dopamine hits for me. I got really into that game right when I started this job 10 years ago. And I was like, actually, you know what? I'm spending more time on my farm than I am on work. So I had to set it aside. But then I think, like a lot of us, it was really COVID that sent me,
back into it,
really back into it as a kind of major part of my life. So
that's interesting. And so one of the courses I believe you taught at the university was queer theory and video games. So really talking about that intersection. So I'm sure it's difficult to define in 5 minutes, but just to give us a foundation and give listeners a foundation, what is queer theory and how is that relevant to video games?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is hard to explain. I'm going to do my best.
That's okay.
And try not to be over simplistic. But I'd say that queer game studies, there's pretty much two branches to it. So the first branch, more or less, is interested in queer representation in games. So games that have LGBTQ++ characters and themes that are, open, participate, like visible to the player. So kind of assessing and critiquing and analyzing what those representations are. But the second branch, which I'd say draws a little bit more on queer theory, is interested in notions of like what is a game, right? So something that queer theory does is it's interested in critiquing those hidden rules and structures of power that govern how we behave, how we form relationships, how we identify in day-to-day life, right? So queer theory is really invested in a critique of heteronormativity, which is basically the idea that heterosexuality is the norm, right? Everyone is or should be heterosexual. That's kind of a system that underwrites a lot of our major social institutions, how people form relationships, and queer theory is interested in critiquing that. Games are also systems that are governed by sets of often hidden rules. And so if you put the two into conversation with one another, it's like, okay, when we think about a game, how do we imagine the rules of that game unfolding, what winning looks like, what losing looks like, who's allowed to have agency in the context of a game, what does agency look like, how much control do you have over the game, what's winning, what's losing, what's failing, right? And so asking those kind of questions invites us to rethink fundamentally what a game might actually be, and what winning looks like, what losing looks like, and so on and so on. I can give an example too, if that's helpful.
Please,
yeah. So the game I mentioned earlier, it's called Queers in Love at the End of the World by Anna Anthropy. And it's a 10-second game. So you can play it for free online if you just Google it. But basically, there's a queer couple and the world is ending, and you have 10 seconds to decide how you're going to spend your last 10 seconds. And every time you start the game, the timer starts going. You can, decide how you're going to interact. You follow some text threads, but no matter what happens at the end of 10 seconds, the game ends and you can restart. So, when we think about how we typically play a game, it's like, well, I want to get to the ending, right? I need to find an ending.
But not this time.
Not this time, exactly, right? So it's like if you try to rush, and there are endings that you can find through the different various kind of text passages that you can choose to pursue. There are endings there. You can get to an end, but if you're clicking so quickly, you're not reading anything. So you're not actually experiencing the story, because there is a story in the game. If you play slowly, then it ends really quickly, right? So this game, I think, is inviting the question, like, how do you want to spend these 10 seconds that you have? Because you can't really win or lose this game. You have to make decisions, and you have to kind of build a world under very challenging circumstances, right? And so that's where we also kind of see the allegory to queer experience, right? It's like, how do you build a life? How do you form relationships? How do you decide how you want to live under conditions that often seem oppressive or hostile, right? And so there's an example, I think, of like queer game design, because it's a game that kind of defies what you expect from games. You know, it doesn't let you play it like a normal game. And there's also this kind of parallel there to queer experience that Anthropy is bringing in.
That's really interesting. That's a great example. I love examples of games that invite you to think differently about how you're interacting with the game itself. Because so many, and especially with AAA games, there's kind of a standard, especially these days, there's a standard way you interact with it. There's a standard control scheme. There's a standard, win state, fail state. And so something like that makes you rethink, how am I even engaging with the systems? I think is so interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of games too are power fantasies, right? Which is, and this is not to say, I get a tremendous amount of pleasure from games where it's like you build skills, you accumulate weapons, you conquer territory, you destroy other people through your, ever heightening power. That's a lot of fun. But queer theory will also invite us to think about, okay, well, what does a game look like where actually, like Queers in Love at the End of the World, you don't have a lot of power. You can't win the game. Your agency is depleted. And so we see some games that maybe interrogate those kind of typical power fantasy situations that you encounter in games.
Yeah. That's super interesting. I know we in a recent episode, we had a local game developer on, and he was talking about wanting to try to come up with an idea of how do you make a game that represents mental health through its mechanics, but then struggling with the balance of, but how do you still make it fun? Which may, and we had lots of conversation around maybe the point is for it not to be fun because mental health challenges aren't necessarily fun. And so it just made me think of that, of looking at the actual systems and the mechanics, and can that reflect the experience of what you're trying to showcase? But I know he was also struggling with, how do you do it in a way that's not reductive?
Exactly.
And I wonder, like, have there been examples of queer representation in games that have been criticized, that haven't been done well because they are maybe more reductive, or whatever the criticisms are?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tendency to in games that try to capture, represent queer experience. There's always worries around the game being what might be called an empathy game, or has been called an empathy game, where the expectation is the player will learn what it's like to inhabit someone else's shoes just by playing a game, right? Because there's no game that can actually capture the fullness of someone's lived experience. Another example of a game by Anna Anthropy is one of her earlier games called Dysphoria, which was a series of mini games that were intended to represent her experience transitioning. And she ended up pulling the game from the web, and has commented publicly about her own ambivalence surrounding it, precisely because it got taken up as a kind of empathy game, where it's like, oh, this game, can teach people what it's like to be trans. Well, it's like, and she's like, well, no, this game represents aspects of my experience transitioning, but it is not supposed to be a full representation of, the trans experience, universalized and homogenized across people, right? So I think that's maybe where things get a little tricky. It's like, how do you tell queer stories and feature queer characters without trying to claim that you're doing something that can be universalized to a large group of people, or a large group of experiences? Yeah,
that makes sense. Interesting.
Yeah, there's we talked about this in one of our previous episodes too, where simulation does not mean explanation, and often games are like simulative, right? Where you may be able to simulate the experience possibly, but we forget that that's one person's perspective. And in the acting industry, we do this all the time, where like someone will write a story. So I'll talk about my experience, like as a brown person, and then they'll assume that then therefore I have represented every brown person out there. And you're like, well, that's not really it. Like, this is what I did in my home with my family, with my upbringing, with a million different inputs and outputs. We're in Calgary right now, and I'm wondering if we can talk about some hard-hitting questions.
Do it. Here we go.
Hard-hitting Calgary questions?
Hard-hitting. So I just moved back here, kind of, still living out of a suitcase, but it's not generally known as a very safe space. from what I understand, both of individuals who don't maybe meet the heteronormative criterias or the cisgendered criterias, or, we call them white spaces at times too. In your research and in your work, especially because you worked in children's literature, I know there's been a lot of, a little backlash of
Yes.
exposing children to queer theory and things like that. I was wondering if you can comment. It's not really a question, I suppose, but do you feel like that's the case here working in this field? Do you feel like there's some pushback? Do you feel like it translates into the literature that you're allowed to even share in your academics? And please only share what you feel comfortable with. And do you feel like games can offer a bridge to that? Or do you feel like also they don't do a good job with that?
Yeah, you weren't kidding when you said that.
I gotta do it.
The big
Guys,
questions.
hitting
The big
questions.
questions.
You gotta
Wow.
do it. I'm curious. We have an expert here. Might as well ask. Yeah.
I mean, my own personal experiences of living in Calgary have been on the whole like quite positive. I think it's possible to find community in most places, and I think too when things get difficult, as I think they are now for the queer and especially trans community, it almost brings people together in a way. And in the context of my own classes, I mean, we're fortunate to still have a kind of academic freedom where we can teach, essentially what we want to teach and what we feel is important to teach. And in many ways, recent events, I'm speaking specifically about, for example, the Danielle Smith's pronoun legislation and anti-trans medical legislation. In my classes, which are focused on, queer theory, games, but also young adult literature, it's an opportunity to historicize some of this and say, they're social and cultural and political events that brought us here. I think our moment is simultaneously, to overuse a challenging word, unprecedented, but also precedented in many ways. It's kind of new iterations of things that we've kind of seen before and in the past, right? Where, where institutions try to control how people live their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, these things have been reoccurring over history. I mean, there's a story. Have you ever read the Mahabharata?
No.
That comes from India. It's 3,000 years old. It's older than the Odyssey, the Iliad, and some argue even larger and bigger in terms of an entire epic. And some people argue that's one of the first representations of trans people in the Indian culture over there. And it's thousands of years old, So these conversations have been around for a very long time. And similarly, in terms of, unfortunately, the oppression around it as well, which is, I don't know, human life repeats itself, I suppose, in some ways.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what you think about the intersection between children's literature and video games. And are there any games that have... So my assumption is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that your expertise is on the story structure. So
Yes.
the hero's journey and
Exactly.
coming of age. You've mentioned that and things like that.
Yeah.
Do you find there's a certain repetition in video games as well in terms of the story structures? Do you think it's integral, or do you feel like people can just make a game without having to know story?
Yeah, so in addition to the undergrad class I teach on queer theory and video games, I teach a graduate seminar. I've taught it twice. That's called Video Games and the Bildungsroman. So the Bildungsroman, it's kind of a lengthy German word that essentially means a coming of age story, or the novel of education is the direct translation. And the Bildungsroman is what is kind of the predecessor of the young adult novel, right? So there are stories that are interested in coming of age, developing some sort of moral sense for navigating the world, coming into what we might understand as kind of a core identity, establishing relationships and so on, separating from one's parents and so on and so on. And so that class was really interested in exploring how these themes and narrative patterns occur in video games, but also mechanically how games might tell us coming of age stories as well. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of overlap there between the two areas. And then I'm also I'm working on a project right now. It's in its very early stages, but it's about how the platformer is itself a kind of developmental narrative or coming of age story. So even thinking back to, I'm trying to make the case that Super Mario Brothers is a work of children's literature, because it is a text that, millions of young people around the world as children encountered some component of the Super Mario Brothers franchise, even if it wasn't the original. So how do we think about a game as not only being a kind of important piece of children's literature, but itself telling a developmental story?
Yeah, and it's so integral in the developmental psychology of kids too. It's fascinating because I see kids now able to pick up video games faster than they pick up reading at times.
Exactly.
And, their ability to just use a tablet or a phone, and you're like, they
Absolutely.
must be built for those brains. They know they have the top psychologist on the line making us do that. Can you tell us what a coming of age story is, and if there are examples in video games that resonate with you?
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk a little bit more about the platformer project. So this is getting back to kind of games as power fantasies. So the object of a 2D platformer, at least, is generally speaking, and I'm using the original Super Mario Brothers as kind of a template, is to go from left to right, sometimes up, sometimes down, but essentially to level up, to grow stronger, to get more powerful, to defeat enemies, and ultimately at the end kind of rescue the princess, right? And so there is kind of a developmental narrative there about where not only the player character, Mario, eats mushrooms, eats fire flowers, grows stronger, but the player themselves is developing while they're playing because they're acquiring the skills in order to progress further and further, right? And so good games will always kind of challenge players at the right moment. So just as the game will teach you one skill, test you on using that skill, and then really challenge you on using that skill, and then kind of repeat that, right? It's like, okay, here's a new skill, here's a new challenge, here's what you have to do to get better and better and better at the game. I'm just coming off of over 60 hours of playing the original Hollow Knight, so I feel this very acutely, which really is, where you have to get better because it's so hard, right? And so the game's constantly testing you. So thinking about a kind of coming of age story in a game that also has to do with mental health and kind of subverts this a little bit is Celeste. Are you familiar?
I don't know Celeste. I haven't played it a lot, but it's on my to play list.
So really fantastic game by Maddie Makes Games is the name of the creator in the studio. 8-bit, so again, that nostalgic itch is being scratched. And it's an extremely hard platformer, but essentially the story is that this protagonist, Madeline, is struggling with anxiety and with depression and decides to climb this mountain, which is both a literal mountain and also within the context of the game,
Sounds
a kind
very
of metaphor.
Calgarian.
Yeah, very exactly. Actually, now that you say it, yes,
a lot of people in Calgary do when they're depressed.
Exactly.
I'll go climb that.
I'm going to climb this extremely lethal-looking, tall mountain. These mountains are covered in spikes, and there's all kinds of other obstacles. But the game actually rewards failure in really interesting ways. So the first time that you die, the game's like, good job, you died. This means that you're learning. And your points in the game are actually a death counter. So the more times that you die, the higher your score is. And at the end of every level, you kind of see your position in the kind of global tally of the death counters. So it's kind of like recircuiting that failure is bad, because failure in games is really about learning and kind of acquiring new skills. And the other interesting parallel with queerness and Celeste is that the creator came out as trans after the game had been released, and then has spoken about how she always viewed her protagonist Madeline as being trans, and the journey up the mountain is kind of, again, metaphorically speaking to that journey into her identity, right? Which is what the coming of age story often is. It's about the discovery of self, navigating it, leaving home, going on a series of adventures through which you discover who you are in the world, what your relationship to the world is going to be like, and then returning to the typical pattern is home away home. So home away home, you can think of like the Wizard of Oz classic example of that. And then returning home, not necessarily to the same home, but to a space that could be kind of characterized as a new type of home. And so that's what Celeste is doing as well. And also, even though it's a challenging game, there's an assist mode to make it a lot more accessible. So it's ensuring that folks can play the game. It's a really good one.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's really neat. When I think coming of age stories inherently overlap with mental health, whether it's overtly, like it sounds like Celeste has pretty overt themes with anxiety and depression, but I think, identity formation is a pretty big piece of mental health, something that I talk lots with people about in therapy. And so that, like you just said, coming of age stories are really that. They're coming into your identity. And I know there were a couple games you had mentioned when we were corresponding ahead of this that really talk about that intersection of queer representation, mental health themes in video games. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit more about those and how those represent them. And
Yeah, Celeste is one of my favorites. Another one of my favorites is Night in the Woods, which came out in around the same time as Celeste, actually, 2018.
Somewhere in there, I think.
And you play as May Borowski. All of the characters in this game are little animals.
Yeah.
So it's almost even illustrated, kind of like a children's picture book. But the themes are quite, I would say, adolescent adult and
May's
like
a
quite
cat, right?
sophisticated.
Yeah,
May's a cat. Her best friend Greg is kind of like dog character. B is a crocodile with like a cigarette hanging out of her mouth. But she returns home to Possum Springs is the name of her, and it's kind of modeled after like a Rust Belt former mining town. So it's kind of on the verge of economic collapse. It's currently happening. Folks are struggling. She returns home because she's had some sort of unspecified mental health incident at college, which you kind of learn more about as the game progresses. But the game, I would call it's like a 2D adventure game with kind of some platforming elements. Like one of the things you get to do is navigate the city by jumping on the power lines that are
cool.
above the city. So there's kind of some fun mechanic stuff there happening as well. But yeah, that game, there's no fail state. Like you can't die. You're just kind of exploring Possum Springs, getting, reconnecting with your friends, reconnecting with your families. The relationships are quite complicated in many of those cases, and learning more about May, who also identifies as queer in the context of the game. Yeah. So, and then at the same time, there's this very strange, again, disappearing persons case. On one of her first days back, May and her friends discover like a severed arm outside a restaurant, and there's some sort of, I won't give too much away because I don't want to spoil it, but there's like a murder mystery thing happening there in tandem with the other kind of coming of age plot. Yeah.
Interesting. That's neat. So what do you feel like that game does well in terms of representing both mental health themes, queer representation?
Yeah, I think it's the same as Celeste in the sense that it's not overly didactic, and that it doesn't really try to home a lesson or a specific lesson. It never feels like the game is teaching you something. It just has these themes that exist in a way that feels like quite organic and natural, and thus engaging, right? And this is something that children's literature is a balance children's literature has to take as well, because the idea is children's literature should teach children something, be it a moral lesson, this goes all the way back to fairy tales and fables and so on, or some sort of moral lesson or lesson about kind of how to be in the world. And there's that tension between if it's too didactic, then you strip away kind of some of the pleasure, but there needs to be a lesson in there somewhere. It's like, well, does there always need to be a lesson? Anyway, but that's what I think that these games do, is they just kind of let the queerness exist. They let the mental health themes exist. It's not trying to teach, again, something like very particular in a direct way. It just feels like quite organic and a natural part of the story and the gameplay experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it allows for the player to resonate with them as they will.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's often. I think that's often a good approach in whatever themes a game is trying to present. Is I think sometimes, there's a lot of reasons there's pushback against certain themes, but sometimes I think one of the pushback is it feels, or at least the language some people will use, it feels too preachy, which maybe overlaps with that. Maybe it's too didactic. Maybe it's they're not just letting the themes exist. Here's the story, and if you identify with it, great. If you don't, that's okay, but we're not. But I think that can also be, I don't know. I struggle with that criticism too. I know sometimes the pushback is, well, you're trying to shove it down my throat, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't know if that's always valid criticism, because what to one person might feel preachy to another person might not.
Yeah, well, and I think it's a question of game genre too, because there isn't a lot of amazing work being done in serious game spaces or educational game spaces, but those games have a completely different context, right? And maybe a different audience, or at least a different circumstance under which folks would be engaging with these games. So I think, if you're sitting down to play an adventure game, you're not necessarily looking for an educational experience, which is something that you might be seeking in other circles, right? Yeah. So I think it comes down to what the player might expect of what they're going to be getting through that game.
And a lot of developers have to be concerned with who their audience is. So some audiences, like you said, there may be games where we do need to make them more didactic and more pedagogical, and because the audience is a group of children who need to learn these things, or a group of players or something like that. And others, it's more of just an experience of representation. But then sometimes there are audiences who will have a lot of backlash against some changes, especially sometimes in the AAA field, where developers will decide to either represent queer characters or queer themes and things like that. I'm curious what you think about, or where do you think some of that backlash comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily want to do a Gamergate deep dive, but I'd say that's the origin of, I think, a lot of, negative criticism that's leveled at games that aren't of the kind of Call of Duty, AAA, how we might kind of quintessentially imagine video games as, again, like power fantasies, often violent, often, needing to get good, like really, really hard. So I think a lot of it just comes from historically who games have been marketed to, who typically has, played games, which often is like, young white men or, men in different countries as well, like across the world. So that's kind of like shaped video game culture. And so like Gamergate was kind of the intensification and the explosion of that. And certainly we still see its after effects in how people talk about representation in games. Yeah,
that makes sense. Why, I don't know if this is too broad a question, but why do you think queer representation in games is important?
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question. Because to a certain degree, I'm like, is it important? Like, yes, I do think it is important, but I don't always sit down, like even as a queer person myself, I don't always sit down and I'm like, I need to see queer people in all of the games that I play, right? Like it isn't something that I necessarily need or seek out in all forms of entertainment, which serve, different purposes in different moments, right? That being said, when like you are able to participate in a game that reflects back at you some dimension of your own lived experience, it's kind of a nice thing to have, right? And I mean, I seek it out sometimes in games, and other times I don't think that I do, because I just want to like smash some stuff or like beat some people up in Streets of Rage or like in Street Fighter or something like that, right? So I think it depends. And I also think that there's as a young, pre-queer person playing like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, there's a lot of stuff out there about like young queer people who identified with like Chun-Li or like Melina and Katana in Mortal Kombat, right? Yeah. So there are ways of like finding queer, or like always used Princess in Mario Kart, right? So there's always ways of like finding, and there's something else queer theory does too. It's like, even if something isn't on the surface queer, there are ways of playing it queerly or engaging with it and having kind of a queer reading or experience through that game, even if it isn't like I'm a gay character, right, in a video game.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'd say it is and it isn't, right?
Yeah.
Like, to that degree.
No, that's interesting. And I appreciate that answer. We kind of joke on every episode of this podcast that we often talk about. It depends for a lot of these things, because these are nuanced, complicated themes. But I think that makes sense, that there are times where being able to identify with the themes, the characters that are being presented is helpful. And I remember reading stories about people that would talk about that. It was a podcast I was listening to where they said they didn't know it was important to them until they had a character who represented their identity, and they thought they found themselves like tearing up, and they thought, what's happening to me? But it was just powerful to see that represented, because it hadn't been.
Exactly.
But then at other times, you have other reasons to play games too, that you just want to smash stuff sometimes, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
And that represents something too.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Should we
just won't go into the depths of what that represents.
I was curious if I think I had mentioned in our correspondence too, if you've played Gone Home. Because I think that's, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know that was another example that really got talked about a lot when it was released as, I'm sure there's been some criticism too. There's always both, but I think it widely was pretty well received for, both just, I think it was one of the, not the first, but it was one of the first popular walking simulators.
Yes.
So for a game that had a different way of interacting with its systems, but also for it told a queer coming of age story. So I was curious if you had thoughts on that or what your experience with that game was.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time with Gone Home. I've taught it in both classes actually, because it applies to the queer theory and video games class and the coming of age and video game class as well. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great work on Gone Home because it's been around for so long. But yes, as you mentioned, you play as Katie, who's a young protagonist who returns home from, I think it's like a year abroad or kind of a gap year, and her whole family is moved and they're living in a new house, and you arrive at the house and no one is there, and there's a note from your sister Sam on the front door that says, I've gone off, like don't try to find me, don't track me down. And you walk into the house and you immediately think you're playing like a horror game because everything is dark, all the lights are off, it's kind of creepy. There's after the note, the first thing that you do is turn on the answering machine, and there's this kind of like breathless message from I think it's from your sister on the phone also. And so you're really kind of gearing up for something horrible to have happened as you explore this house and like try to track down your missing sister. But it turns off she's run off with her girlfriend. And at the end of the game, like everything kind of, I know, spoilers.
What?
But actually, a former student, Eden Middleton, who's a mutual acquaintance of ours, has done some great work on Gone Home, where they look at the juxtaposition between the queer story and also how the game kind of tricks you into thinking it's a horror game. Like in one moment, you go up to a bathroom upstairs, and the bathtub is like covered in red, and it just looks like someone's been murdered in the tub, but it turns out it was hair dye. And when you look at it closely, it kind of activates this voiceover from your sister talking about like this intimate queer experience where she and her girlfriend were like dyeing each other's hair. So anyway, lots to say about this game, obviously, because I feel like I'm already rambling about it, but it also came out at an interesting, like in the kind of Gamergate era, and was a target of kind of post Gamergate backlash because it told a queer love story. And because I think a lot of people who played it felt tricked. They're like, oh, I'm getting this house exploration horror game, but I'm actually getting this like kind of queer love story at the center of it. And it turns out the game wasn't dangerous at all. And there's no fail state. You can't die. You know, there's no kind of like, again, like accrual of power or conquering of territory and things like that. So part of the way that game operates is, again, by playing with genre a little bit and convincing the player that they're going to have one experience when in fact they have a completely different experience. And I think that that's both interesting and also has the potential to be troubling, and that like, especially as a queer person playing it, as soon as you start seeing like pulling at the threads, it's like, oh God, someone, you know, harmed themselves, you know, someone has been, you know, gay bashed or, you know, beat up or something like that. So you're kind of like bracing yourself. So it is a relief on the one hand to get a different kind of story, but also the way that it plays on those tropes could be seen as troubling. But again, there's a lot of great writing about this game. There's great Bo Ruberg, who's a queer game theorist, has a great piece on the queerness of speedrunning Gone Home, and if speedrunning is a queer practice, because you can pass that game in like 11 seconds or something like that if you just like take a straight shot, pun intended, you know, up the stairs and get the key and then go into the attic. But the game means a lot to queer players as well. There's a lot of writing on, you know, how important that game was for folks especially when it first came out. And yeah, as you mentioned, an early iteration of the walking simulator, which is originally a, you know, derisive term for games like that, but has been kind of, I think, reclaimed and is like a legit category on Steam and stuff like that. So
for sure. Because I know that there's criticism of that, of is it really a game? Because but yeah, it's, I think exactly that subverting of expectations is part of what makes it interesting and part of the risk. I think anytime any type of media subverts expectations, there's a risk there of people are going to be disappointed, upset, backlash, and that's sometimes part of the purpose. But I think, in my opinion, I think it was done well in Gone Home, but because I do remember that. I remember feeling very uncomfortable and scared. I don't really like horror games generally. And I remember I was like, I'm so, like, I had to take breaks. I was like, something terrible has happened.
I know, it's like the seventh guest, guest all over again. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it is nice. It's nice. And you're like, oh, this is actually quite a sweet story in the end.
Yeah.
With some overtones of, because it's been years since I played it, but I think you discover, complications, and part of, I think, why Sam ran off is because I think the game takes place in 1995, I think. And so a time when maybe this was less accepted, and so she felt she had to leave. I can't remember exactly what the story was around that piece, but still with some elements that then would be relevant to mental health, right? Being accepted, not accepted by your family. So yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, it's interesting because another game I'll shout out is No Longer Home. I don't know if you've heard of that one. It's an indie game from, I'm going to say, like 2019 that was only recently ported to PS4 and PS5. Okay. But what was interesting about the coming of age in video games class, the second time I taught it, I made it all revolve around games that had to do with like houses and homes, which seems to be a recurring motif in a lot of these games. And a lot of them, if not are not horror games, play with horror tropes, like Gone Home, Night in the Woods does as well. Right. What Remains of Edith Finch, which isn't necessarily a queer game, but again, like a coming of age game that is also like very much a horror game on a number of different levels. Are about houses, haunted houses, exploring houses. And so there's that interesting connection again, because the narrative pattern of the Bildungsroman is home away home. A lot of these games are set in like a home or inviting you to explore a home or discover a home. Yeah. But No Longer Home is a great one. Also has some mental health themes in it. And it's a short game. You can play it in like 90 minutes or 2 hours. And it's just a very kind of moody, atmospheric, point and click adventure game set in the UK, and it's two non-binary university students who are graduating, and they're in a relationship, and they're moving out of this house, and they're having like one last barbecue with their friends, and one of the pair has to leave the country because of affordability issues. And so it's just set on this one night. You explore the house, you interact with your friends at the barbecue, you have kind of conversations, but there is like this unusual, like solemn, it's a very like vibey game. And as you explore the house, you discover you have these roommates who are all kind of monsters. And the monsters represent, like, you have conversations with the roommates, and it turns out kind of, as you discover, manifestations of some kind of like anxiety or fear or about this extremely transitional moment in both of these protagonists' lives. So it's a really interesting game. When I taught it for the first time, the last time I taught this course, and the students were kind of mixed on it. Some of them really loved it, and some of them were like, I don't know. But it is a cool one that also has those themes of coming of age mental health and queerness that just kind of breathe like naturally within the game.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and home as a theme, I think, makes a lot of sense why it gets explored a lot, because home is a complicated concept, can mean a lot, can carry a lot of weight to it. And I think, again, themes of being accepted, not accepted within the home, especially for queer youth, I mean, obviously that's a huge piece, right? The rates of youth who are needing housing support, who identify LGBTQ, is much higher, significantly higher. And that's part of the reason, right? They're getting kicked out. And so the concept of home is not the same for what it might be for somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting.
Yeah. So we're headed into the final stretch here, just looking at the time. But is there anything we haven't covered today that you wanted to talk about, or that we haven't asked you about yet?
Oh my gosh. Not that I can think of. I'm trying to think of the other games I came in prepared to talk about. We've talked about Celeste, talked about Gone Home, talked about No Longer Home, we talked about Night in the Woods.
There was Grease.
Oh, Gris. Yeah. GRIS.
I didn't get it right either.
Yeah. The French word for gray.
Right. Okay. I don't speak French.
Sorry. Grease lightning that. Yeah.
Edit that out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a really interesting one. Not like overtly, no queer representation necessarily, but it's a game that's all about grief and mourning. I just recently played it a couple of months ago, and it's also a platformer, which is interesting. But essentially, you're this very like small female-coded protagonist. And at the beginning of the game, again, it's a very like atmospheric game. The music is beautiful. It's beautifully animated and illustrated. And, there's like a giant statue that kind of crumbles, and again, you get the sense that it's this representation of loss, or this protagonist has lost someone. And mechanically, it does interesting things, because at the beginning of the game, the only thing you can do is walk very slowly. You can't jump. You don't have access
Getting
to
the
any
criticisms of the walking.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have access to any of the kind of like typical platformer mechanics that you need. But slowly, as you navigate the terrain, you gain, powers that aren't really like powers in the traditional sense. Like you can't. It's kind of like there's some light puzzles to solve. There's no fail state. Like you can't die. You never have to start over. But you solve these puzzles. You collect things. You interact with the environment, and eventually you can jump, and then you can kind of turn. She has this really like cool illustrated like triangle dress that turns into a block that becomes like kind of a stomping mechanism. And then the last kind of quote unquote power that you get is she gains her voice back, and she can sing, and singing actually transforms parts of the environment that lets her navigate it in new ways. So again, like not necessarily like heavy-handed with the mental health theme, but it's obviously, it is a game that feels like it's about loss, mourning, grief, even depression, and what it feels like to wrestle with that, and not even like overcome it in some kind of triumphant way, but rather just kind of live with it throughout the course.
There's
of the
definitely
game.
like a journey aspect to it, where you're just processing and moving, and even in the name, right? Like depression and anxiety and the mental health can feel gray. You feel quite subdued, quite monotone. So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Are there any stories that you wish or you feel need to be represented in video games that we haven't seen so far?
Oh my gosh. That's a great question. I mean, yes. Do I know what they are? I don't know.
That's a great answer, actually.
That is a good answer. Yeah. That is a good question.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just like, I like teaching games and playing games that are surprising. So maybe that's why I can't necessarily say what they should be.
It wouldn't be surprising if you could do it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a queer game designer named Robert Yang who does these kind of really interesting mini games that capture elements of kind of the queer experience. I teach one of them in my undergraduate class. I don't know what this podcast is rated necessarily, but it's a cruising simulator.
Okay.
So it's like you're in a truck stop bathroom in the mid 20th century at a urinal, and you have to like make eye contact with the people who are kind of next to you, this game's actually based on a real life sting operation that police had in truck stops in the US in the mid 20th century, where they set up kind of hidden cameras, and then they'd have police go in plain clothes and like essentially entrap gay men who were cruising in public spaces. So you kind of have to keep one eye out of the window for like, if a police car is there, you need to run, you need to like kind of make eye contact, so it's kind of like connect with the person. But if you have to make sure they're not an undercover cop, so it's like, how do you assess that? And often it's the ones who are too eager who are going to turn out to be cops. And then if you get caught, the game ends. But there's no nudity in the games. All of the kind of suggestive body parts are guns. And the reason that Robert Yang did this is because he's like, there's so many violent games on Steam, but my game, I originally wanted nudity, but Steam kept banning it. So he's like, okay, I'm going to make all of the body parts guns because this is acceptable.
And Steam won't ban that.
Yeah, and Steam won't ban that, and they didn't, right? So, so again, like it's kind of a comment on hypermasculinity in games, but it's kind of built around like mechanically a very specific part of like the queer experience, in that time period. So I teach it. It's kind of fun to teach to students, and they're like, the ones who live at home are like, I couldn't play this while my parents were around. It's like you're in a bathroom and there are guns. Like, what's happening?
What are you playing?
Anyway, yeah. So anyway, games like that I find really kind of surprising and unexpected, but also leave a lot to, think about and unpack, even though this game is, it's like a 20-30 minute experience. Yeah.
That's neat. Yeah. I think the indie space has so many opportunities for that, where they can surprise you with what the themes are they're representing, the mechanics they do. They can just get so much more creative in some ways.
Exactly.
But then I also appreciate when AAA games are able to get a little bit creative within the confines of what they have to do to make money. But
no, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, our final question that we ask every guest is, are video games the hero or the villain?
Oh gosh, we've got a binary question here, and as a
I
queer
know.
theorist, my
Yeah,
job
I
is to
know.
undo
We don't operate on a
binaries.
spectrum here.
I'm like, it depends, but like a villain, I'm going to say a villain only in the sense of like a fabulous like Disney villain like
Yes.
Ursula.
Oh, good answer.
Yeah, so it's
we
like
haven't had that answer.
the
That's good.
subversive villain, the
Yes.
villain that you're always rooting for, the villain that
Yeah.
you want to be, secretly or otherwise.
Nice.
So it's like,
Excellent.
who's truly the hero, right?
Love it.
Like,
Love
yeah.
it.
Love it.
That's a great answer.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to plug? Anywhere people can find you? Or
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, so my work on video games, my chapter on Caper and the Castros in my book, Queer Anxieties of Young Adult Literature and Culture, which is available anywhere. Support your local indie bookstore. But otherwise, yeah, I'm at the University of Calgary. You can find me on the University of Calgary Department of English website and get links to my other work there. So yeah.
Note down the course codes.
Yeah.
Get into the class.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
well, thank you very much for your time and for being on. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we loved the discussion. And yeah, well, hopefully we can have you on again in the future.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, welcome
All right,
back.
welcome back,
Oh my
everybody.
gosh,
We're
what a
here.
conversation with Derritt.
That was fantastic. Yeah. I feel like we say that after all our guests, but I think
But for this one, we
but
need it.
especially no,
No, we love all our guests. We love.
I
all
think
our
we've
guests,
been
yeah.
very lucky and
Yes.
blessed in this season 1 of our podcast to have.
Well, I was
great
actually
guests.
telling Derritt that before we started shooting, they were asking like how things are going, and I was saying that I was astonished at how many people want to talk about this stuff.
I know.
The intersection of mental health and video games, and how awesome they are at talking about it. Like
Absolutely.
I can't think about. I mean, we'll do this in our final season 1 episode where we talk about our favorite moments, but there's so many.
Yeah.
And I felt like this interview is one of them too, which is it's so incredible to have like a scholar in the field who also is such a gamer nerd. you
Yes.
know? Like to the point where I was like, I don't know that game. What is he talking about?
I know.
Yeah,
put
yeah.
our gamer cred to shame
I
a little
know,
bit.
I know,
But that's a good
okay.
thing.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, the whole point is we want to be talking to experts. We want to be curious.
Exactly.
We want to be the dumbest people in the room.
And we usually are.
we usually are.
Happily.
Except now.
Now we're equally dumb. Who's dumber? Oh no.
So what were just, first initial impressions? What stood out to you from our conversation with Derritt? What were some of the highlights for you?
I think how incredibly passionate they were about the field, both queer theory and video games. I mean, both of these are fairly niche fields in academia.
Yeah.
And to bring them together is, it must be like someone who's carved their own path.
Yeah.
Kind of how Kenzie Gordon also did something similar with their research areas. I liked hearing about their journey from children's literature to video games as well. And the fact that they teach English means that, they love stories. And we don't actually talk a lot about stories so far. We've talked about mental health and the intersection, and we talk about mechanics and systems and all that. But it was nice to hear someone who's an expert on story, and it really stood out to me talking about the coming of age part. And how that's so integral. I mean, we know coming of age stories all the time, but I don't necessarily have that perspective that Derritt brought, which was coming of age is so incredibly poignant to individuals who are going through the queer journey.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's a big part that stood out to me too, because you think about, coming out as a part of the queer experience.
Yeah.
And so coming of age is often a time when the coming out happens, and coming to terms with your identity. There's so much there that matches up.
And domicide, the loss of home.
Yeah.
Which you made such a great point in the podcast about, bridging off of what Derritt was saying about many of these stories are about loss of home. And of course, that happens a lot to the youth that we've worked with, of course, and the backgrounds that we've had in the field of mental health as well. I see it all the time. And you're right. It's interesting that, I mean, it's not interesting, it's sad and horrible, but it is interesting that it gets reflected in the stories then.
Yeah.
Whereas some individuals who deal with mental health or some other issues reflect their stories differently. But it seems to be right now, currently where we're at as society, the common theme is coming back to home. And I think it's even metaphorical, not just physical, like the physical geographical space. I think, especially individuals who are going through like perhaps the transition journey, they're coming back home into their own bodies, coming back home into their own identities.
Yeah.
And there's a loss of identity that they struggle with growing up. Does that feel like that resonates?
Yeah,
with you?
I think that's really well said, actually, because home, like what does home mean? It can mean a lot of different things, but I think home is a sense of, home base. It's an anchor. It's a sense of safety. Hopefully, I think that an ideal definition of home is a sense of safety, a sense of familiarity, a sense of comfort, stability. I think there's lots of different words we could throw on it. And so, I love that way of thinking about it. Of sometimes you hear it a lot. Home doesn't have to be a physical place, right? Home is where the heart is.
Home is where the heart is.
Yeah, coming home to who you are, I think, can be a huge piece. And unfortunately, for some people, that sometimes has to be not in the house of origin. Yeah. That's. I was thinking about that when Derritt was talking about Gone Home and how it plays on horror vibes. Like you expect it to be a horror game, but then within that, it's playing on these tropes.
Yeah. Frog got your trope?
Yeah.
Nailed it.
That was dumb. Anyways, Gone Home plays on these horror. You expect it to be a horror game, but then within that, it's playing on these tropes of you expect, as you start to uncover the main character or the main character's sister is queer, you start to expect something terrible has happened to them because there's this trope of bad things happening to queer characters, to characters of color. This is a common thing that happens in media, and so that was just interesting to think of that. That's a piece that you might expect too, and it's you wouldn't necessarily expect that just because there's a character and now I'm going to expect something bad. It's I'm learning that this character was queer. Now what kind of horrible bullying, harassment, abuse did they go through? And it's
are going to go through.
Yeah, because that's the reality of our world.
This is like your schemas are being built, right?
Yeah.
And different schemas have different outcomes that are predictive of your current biases. I was thinking about that too, and I'm like, what's the difference if the main character was like a cisgender 6'4" white guy, like Joel from Last of Us? We would maybe go through the same thing, but he'll figure it out. He'll fight off the villain or something like that, right? You may create a horrific environment, but we go no, but he can handle it. Now, what if we displace Joel and we put in like a petite young girl, and all of a sudden we're gonna think, but that person can't handle it because of some of the preconceived biases we may have. Right. And horror movies do this all the time, right? It's the damsel in distress, it's the who dies first in the cabin. It's like you mentioned, it's either a person of color or someone else in sort of the marginalized communities. And I was thinking about, I feel like there was two ways to look at Gone Home. There's the schemas we put on the characters themselves as the players, which is that perhaps a queer individual or someone who's a bit more sensitive to how society is working, we may think, something bad's going to happen to them. But I was also curious how, because I think it got some backlash and people are like, well, I wanted it to be a horror movie or I wanted it to feel. And I'm like, but that is the meta subversion. And for someone who wasn't expecting what the game was supposed to be, it's kind of like, I was like, if I apply that metaphor in real life, it's how many people who don't accept LGBTQ individuals, they treat them with fear and they expect horror. And so the game itself is basically going, no, look, there's absolutely nothing wrong. You see blood in the tub, right? Because you want to see something fearful in this individual or in this scenario. But really, it's just hair dye. Yeah. And it's no different than the hair dye you might use to cover up your grays, right?
Yeah. That's interesting.
That's how I was kind of reading into it. It's like a meta conversation on absolutely that which we don't know, we fear.
Yeah. So that's cool. Right? I like thinking of that because it again speaks to the unique way that a video game can tell this story, because it's doing that through subverting your expectations based on the game mechanics and the setting. And because you do, I think Derritt was describing it. You walk into this empty, dark house. There's, totally. It might even be at the end, but there's a point where you're going up to an attic. And so there's some spooky stuff in there that it creates certain expectations. But they're only there because of our schema. We're putting that on as we have a schema of what a horror video game might be like. But it's kind of this commentary and this meta framework that, when you don't understand something, when there's prejudice towards something, you have a schema that you're placing onto it, that you have 100%. Expectations, preconceived notions.
Yeah. And then the game subverts it.
Yeah.
Which is you just like the antidote to any sort of ism is contact and conversation. And you realize, oh, okay, my schemas were wrong. I need to update that. Hopefully.
Yeah.
That's what happened. So yeah, it was just such a fascinating, I think every aspect of a lot of stuff that Derritt was saying, I was like, I want more of that. I want to learn more of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. I wanted to talk a little bit about, because we talked in the conversation about queer representation, why queer representation is important, is it important, and how that overlaps with mental health, because that's our podcast. And I think, just anecdotally, it makes sense to me, and some of our conversation with Derritt, I think, was reflecting that. And I see this in some of my work as a therapist, that at the end of the day, I think everybody just wants to belong. They want to feel like they're quote unquote normal. Yeah. They want to feel like they're not weird, other, somehow different in a negative way, right? Not that it's not bad to be different, but I think we innately have that fear. And so having some aspect of your identity represented. In this case, we were talking about queer representation, but it can be any aspect of identity. Totally. Having that represented so that you can resonate with that, so you can feel like, oh, I'm not alone. I'm not this other because I'm never represented. I've heard from people where that has been very powerful for them, where they identify, they resonate with a character just because it feels like, oh, that's me. That's my experience to some degree. And so I think anecdotally that certainly has benefits to mental health.
Well, the research seems to back it up too. I was reading some papers prior to this, and there was a meta-analysis, and we'll post it up afterwards, but about how individuals resonate with their avatar when they're given the choice to change their pronouns or their likeness, and including their gender. And it creates a sense of ease and calmness when that individual is playing the game. And in fact, it's probably also does the opposite. The paper didn't talk about this, but the more in likeness you have with the avatar you're playing in the game, probably the more immersive the game feels for you. Yeah. Which is actually kind of a win-win if you think about it for developers. Like if you want to really sell your game, include everybody, means the most people will buy it, and also create avatars that represent the audience you're trying to sell to, because more likely they're going to feel more immersed in that game. Yeah. And then the article went on to look at some other things that games have done for individuals. The perseverance argument stands, irrespective of your sexual or gender identity. Games give you a sense of perseverance, goal setting, a sense of positive self-regard when you accomplish things. And that's also poignant for individuals in the LGBTQ or 2S spectrum. What else was in that? Did you read any?
Yeah, I was reading an article, and we'll put it in our credits as well. That talked about, it was an interesting mix of results, where because we know generally from research, and I'll put a reference or something about it, but it's pretty well known, especially in the mental health community, that queer individuals, especially queer youth, are at higher risk for a slew of mental health challenges, self-harm, and suicide risk, self-harm, like significantly higher risk. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And so we were interested, well, does representation in media, does that mitigate that risk? Does that help? Because anecdotally it seems to help, but this is backed by the research. And this article I was reading said what they were able to find, and again, this is one article. It's an area that probably needs to be researched a lot more. It didn't necessarily lower the risk for these things, but it did increase the resilience, which I thought was interesting. Yeah. And when I was thinking about that, it kind of makes sense, because what are the things that increase the risk? Well, mostly it's things like, are they getting bullied at home, at school? Are they being kicked out of their house? Are they like these are the big problematic and systemic things that are really increasing their risk. So is having a queer video game character that they can resonate with, is that going to lower those risks? Well, no. But if it makes them that idea of I can relate to them, their resilience might be increased. So that those are different ideas. So I thought that was interesting. They also went on to say that it didn't necessarily reduce suicide risk, which again makes sense. That's would be looped in with those other pieces. But what it did have the chance to do was decrease stigma for non-queer individuals. So again, the more we're exposed to these things, or the more we're normalized to these things that we haven't been exposed to or don't understand, hopefully, the less we experience prejudice, which might lead to less bullying of,
of course.
of queer individuals.
Of course, that feels like a very logical conclusion. In
Yeah.
many online games that have inclusive environments, I was reading about like Minecraft or Roblox or I think Final Fantasy 14, the MMO. Final Fantasy specifically was called out as one of the most inclusive environments for queer identifying individuals.
I believe that.
Yeah, and I'm like, of course, because going back to what you said, everyone's trying to look for a place to call home. And if we can do it in the virtual environment, I think that's still a step in the right direction. Of course, it'd be great to do it in the reality, and that's what we need to work towards. And I guess what seems to be sort of lacking is the research around this stuff and the intersection. There's video games and mental health, but now we need to do the subsections, right?
Yeah.
Like how is it affecting queer mental health specifically, or how is it affecting people of color's mental health specifically? And I think that would be a very interesting, fruitful research study to look at. Seeing and then what games do a positive thing, and maybe some games don't do a good job.
Totally.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah. And I agree that the subset, and then how does that interact with all those other elements we talked about in our first episode, and since then of, again, just video games can promote pro-social, like social connection. They can promote, perseverance, like you were saying earlier. So there's all these other benefits that generally are going to be helpful that aren't necessarily queer experience specific, but then how does this maybe benefit or not benefit? I want to learn more about that.
What did you think of Derritt's answer when you asked, does queer representation matter?
I thought it was interesting. I thought it was a really genuine and great answer that made sense. That, sometimes yes, sometimes they look for that and they resonate with that, and having that represented is an important experience. And then sometimes they just want to have fun. Because games, I think, can represent so many things. I even think about, how do I play games? Sometimes I want to play a game that's story heavy, so that I can be affected by that story, by the characters. And sometimes I want to play a game that's gameplay oriented and it's just fun and mechanically sound. And I think it's one of the wonderful things about games. They're so complex and multifaceted that you can kind of find different things in them. So I don't know. That answer made sense to me. What was your thought on that answer?
No, I thought it was a great answer too. I think I can't remember where I learned this, but there's a fallacy where it's people elevate part of the truth to the whole truth. And I think that we often do that with identity. We think like someone's queer, so that must be their entire identity, and it's like, no, that's part of their identity. And there's so many other aspects of it, which means there obviously are going to be so many different stories, video games, experiences that individuals want to engage in. And I thought it was a very great answer. I'd be curious to what our viewers will say. So I get in the comments. Like, what do you think? Do you think queer representation matters? And if so, why and how? And where,
because it's going to be such an individual specific thing too, right? For some people, that representation is probably going to matter more than to other people.
Totally.
And I hear those different in just generally too, talking about immersion, and do you feel immersed when you relate to your character? I hear different answers to that all the time. Some people feel like, I'm more immersed when the character feels like me. And other people say, no, that doesn't matter to me. It's just, is the character well written? Is the world immersive?
Totally.
So I think it's just different things resonate for different people.
I think ultimately the question is also a little bit like of a misnomer, right? Because obviously it does matter, right? But it's the degree to which it matters is going to be so personal. And I think it's unfortunately right now there's lack of representation.
Right.
And we know that's harmful because it doesn't, for example, things we were talking about, doesn't reduce stigma, it doesn't increase contact, it doesn't create a safe space for people. How that representation manifests, though, I think one of the things I was thinking about while we were doing the interview was also, it just feels like sometimes people of minority groups aren't allowed to experiment. We're supposed to hit it out of the park right away. I feel like this with movies. I feel like this with short films. I feel like this with BIPOC representation. We get one shot, and then if it's not good or it's the perfect kind of representation, then people go. And I feel like even people from the same community that the game or the show is trying to represent will be the first people to, give it backlash or something like that. And I'm like, I think we just need to be a little bit like more open to, like, we don't, like, especially queer people, they're not going to get necessarily the same opportunities that a cisgendered white dude's going to get to make their game. Most likely. I'm generalizing, but most likely. And so maybe the game's not going to hit out of the park right away. Maybe it is going to be too on the nose right away, or maybe it's going to be too preachy. but we get iterations until we finally get to the part that feels, I don't know, whatever that might be, a masterpiece or something like that, the next game, award-winning game, you know?
Yeah.
So I just think it's important that we need to allow things to be iterative.
Yeah. I think that's a really salient point and really well said, because did stories just come out of the gate being great?
No, we had Brothers Grimm.
Yeah.
Before they turn into fairy tales.
Like stories have to go through iterations. And I think, there's heavier criticism aimed at stories representing minorities so that they don't get that chance to, if it isn't the perfectly told story, this is terrible.
Yeah.
It's we live in a very all or nothing society these days, it seems, but that's one example of that.
Yeah.
And it's great that, we talk a lot about indie games with Derritt, and
Yes.
the indie space, I think, allows for a lot more of that experimentation.
Yeah.
And there have been more and more representation in AAA games. I don't want to do a disservice to what's been done there.
No, people are making incredible progress everywhere, which is great.
But there's room for improvement. I think there's room for more openness. That's probably not a controversial take.
And if you don't like it, you don't have to play it.
Right.
So it's not really a big deal.
Yeah.
Either way. Yeah.
Hey, I have a question for you.
Oh my gosh! Ready?
Okay, so thinking about again, talking about characters being immersive, and this isn't a skill testing question.
Oh, okay.
It's just
it's a question.
It's
Every
just
question
an
from you
opinion
is a skill
question.
testing question.
You're right.
Yeah.
You got to take it seriously.
I have to.
One of the changes that recent modern games have made is some of them don't do. I don't think we've talked about this yet on the podcast. Some of them don't do gender choices anymore, like male, female for your character. They say body type A, body type B.
Yes.
And there's been some backlash around that of people saying like, the typical like, do we have to change this too? We have to change everything. But I was curious what you thought of that. Like, does that change matter? Is it important? Again, we're maybe not the people to be answering this question, but
yeah, I mean, once again, always two dudes talking about gender. But I think it's an interesting one because it goes back to that iterative experimentation question.
Yeah.
Why not try it?
Yeah.
What's the worst that we can go back to female, male? Like really, if you want the binaries, they'll be there.
Yeah.
But if it makes a little bit more of an inclusive space for that individual who's going to play and go, oh, this is amazing, this feels non-binary to me, which is awesome, or really gender's about so many other things, why do we just base it on sex characteristics anyways? That's an interesting discussion to have. And I always think it's always a far more, personally anyways, I'll speak personally, far more rewarding experience if you bring in some curiosity instead of going straight to an opinion, good or bad. And I don't know necessarily whether it's a good or a bad thing. I think for me, it probably doesn't affect me as much because I don't necessarily, those aren't my specific challenges in life right now. But for someone who it is, I think, like, why not?
Yeah.
Let them try it. Let them cook for a bit. And if it doesn't work, then they'll go back, I'm sure. Yeah, but it's also like you could criticize anything.
Yeah.
You're like, why are there only type A, B, and why isn't there type A, B, C, D, E, F, G? I'm thinking of some of the RPG games I've played that have done that. Yeah, you get two body types of each gender, quote unquote, and then and you could go further. You cannot go further. And then you could also argue the other way. So we want to be neutral in some ways. You can argue the other way where it takes away representation from other marginalized group like women, who often also feel marginalized in the world. And you could argue that also men feel under because some people do want to be the male hero.
Right.
And that's okay too.
Yeah.
So I don't know, make it a toggle.
Yeah.
Toggle on gender, toggle it off.
Yeah, yeah.
If you really want to see it, that you can see it. And if you don't want to see it, then you don't have to.
Yeah, maybe the simplest solution is the best solution.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good point.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a good point about, again, it's that experimenting. Like, let people experiment. And really, at the end of the day, is that people have an opinion about everything these days. And I get that's the content creator space. We're sitting here having an opinion about things, but it just feels like, is that the thing we're going to have an opinion about? Again, for me, I look at that and I didn't even clock it until I was reading articles about it. I was like, oh, that's a thing?
Because it's not our lived experience.
Right,
so
exactly. So
we
it's
come
not
from
for
a bit
me.
of privilege. Yeah, it's not for us.
And I recognize that.
Yeah.
Whereas, like you were saying, for somebody who that is for, I think it can make a difference. And that's great.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm biased. I'm a therapist, but I feel like anything that's making somebody feel a little bit more included, a little bit more welcomed, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens with that.
Yeah. I feel the same way about like when they change gender in stories or race and things like that. Like everyone's up in arms about a female Bond.
Right.
You know, like,
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, it may not be what your prototype of James Bond looks like, but what's the worst thing that can happen? They'll do a Jane Bond. It'll make one movie. It might do well, might not. And then you move on and there'll be more James Bonds. You know, like people are just like, I need to make this a problem in my life right now. And I'm like, really? Aren't we all struggling to pay rent right now? Like, is this really the issue that matters? Yeah. So I don't know. I feel kind of ambivalent right now to some of those things because I'm also not the expert to speak on them.
Right.
You know, but
yeah. But I guess, you know, devil's advocate a little bit. That's partly why I think people get so attached to it, is because art is such a important piece of life and an escape for people. And it brings joy and life and meaning in a time when life can be hard and the world can be difficult and expensive. And so they do. And you know,
that's true.
Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't ease up a little bit, but I think that's part of why we cling to these things, because they mean something. I mean, I think about the Star Wars sequel movies that were heavily criticized, and I had my own reaction to them, and I've reflected on that. I'm like, it's just, like, at the end of the day, it's just movies. Yeah. But Star Wars means a lot to me.
Yeah, it does.
And so, yeah, I guess I can see why people get really attached to things and say, well, this isn't my version of this, and my version matters. And yeah, it does. And also, maybe that version can be different sometimes too. I see both sides.
maybe you can fight for it, but you can take the heat off the rhetoric.
Yeah.
You know, like maybe assuming the worst isn't the best way to start. Maybe, I don't know. You're right. Like I get it too, right? Like if someone replaced some of my favorite characters, I'd be like, no, that's not who I resonate with. And maybe I'd be angry about it. You know, like how would you feel if someone replaced Luke Skywalker, did the first 4 movies with Luna Skywalker, just changed the gender? That's the only thing they changed.
Yeah, yeah.
It's also like the to be devil's advocate, a cheap attempt at it also fails and sucks too.
Yeah.
Right? It's like we've seen movies where they've just tried to be like, the only thing different about this is we've changed the gender or the race. And we go, well, now you're pandering. And that doesn't feel good either.
Yeah.
You know, so if you're going to do something, do it with intention. And ultimately, if you can elevate the craft and make it good, it'll shut up any sort of dissent.
It's true. Yeah. If it's good.
Yeah.
That's all that
Nobody
matters.
cares. Nobody cares. You know, Baldur's Gate has so much representation, Baldur's Gate 3, and the game's just fantastic. And you can romance anybody, you can change your gender, you can change your avatar, whatever it makes. And it's not an issue because the game is also so good.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. All right. Well, we've been yapping on for long enough.
Oh, yeah.
Let's get to our skill testing questions.
God, speaking of all or nothing. Okay. You're playing your favorite games again.
Yes.
Because you are a gamer who loves to play games again and again and again.
Well, sometimes.
This is called self-soothing.
Sometimes.
And research shows that people do this because it's predictable. You know, so it reduces anxiety for people to do things.
Okay.
And watch the same shows and play the same games. So I get it.
Okay. Thank you.
But now it's a skill testing question.
Oh, boy.
All right. So,
now it's causing me anxiety.
Yeah. In our conversation around queer representation.
Yes.
The 2 games you're playing are Last of Us and Last of Us 2. Mm-hmm. And there is queer representation in the second game.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And the first game.
And the first game. What same
I'm gonna add to your skill testing question.
Please do. Please do.
Okay.
Who are the characters in the game that would identify as queer?
Oof. Oh, I'm nervous now. Okay.
Let's see if you can get them.
Certainly Ellie, the main character of part 2.
Yep.
And that's known. It's talked about in part 1
and part 1,
and mainly the DLC of part 1, Left Behind. But Ellie, she's a queer character. She's a gay character. She has a relationship with a character named Dina in part 2. So Dina would also identify as queer.
Technically, yes, we would think that. Yep.
And so that's 2 of them. The other one, I believe, would be a character called Lev.
Oh, man. I didn't think you were going to get Lev.
Lev is an interesting one because Lev... Now, it's been years since I've played it. I'm only in the first kind of section of the game. This is the first time I've ever replayed it since playing it the first time.
Yeah.
From what I remember... because Lev is a male identifying character, but it's revealed later that they're biologically female, but wanted to be part of this kind of warrior group that they're in.
Right.
But females were given a certain role in that. They wanted to be like a fighter, a warrior, and so presented as male.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting kind of backstory to.
Yeah. Crushing it.
Yeah.
And you missed.
No, I didn't miss anyway. Okay, but okay. Well, I know in part 1, Bill and Frank are classic characters.
Yeah.
Bill, you never meet Frank in the game.
Yeah, but
and
in
then
the show,
the HBO show did what is heralded as the best episode of the series, and one of the best episodes of television is the Bill and Frank episode.
Yes.
Played by the wonderful Nick Offerman. I cannot remember the person who plays Frank off the top of my head, but I know Nick Offerman because I love Parks and Rec as well. Did I do it? Did I get it right?
Yeah, you got them all. Oh, that was amazing.
That's good.
Yeah.
Lev's one of my favorite characters in part 2.
Yeah.
He's an awesome character.
Yeah.
All right. Are you ready for your skill testing question?
Probably not going to be a softball.
Yours is of the psychological variety. We talked about identity, and identity is related to the concept of personality.
Oh, God.
Now, there's personality theories in psychology. Now, the validity of any of these personality theories, not the point of this.
Yeah.
But one of the popular personality theories is called the Big Five, the 5-factor model. There's 5 personality traits, 5 core traits that it talks about. Can you name these 5 or any of the 5?
Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, assertiveness, and neuroticism.
You got 4 out of 5.
Wait. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion. It used to be ocean. That was the acronym.
Yes,
And
you got
then-
it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm already impressed. 4 out of 5.
Oh my God. No, I do know this. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion. The A is agreeableness.
Yes. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I am very impressed. You got all 5.
Yes, I did.
Wow.
Thank you.
I'm speechless. I thought you would get some of them.
Yeah.
But I don't think I could
It's
have
been a
answered
long time.
that.
I actually have never taken a personality psych class either.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah, I
I don't think I could have named all 5 of them.
Yeah. I just remember the acronym, ocean.
We both got our skill testing
Oh,
questions.
yeah, I feel good. I feel pumped.
Does that mean we finally leveled up?
We did. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Now we're level 2.
Great. Well, it's been an honor, as always.
Always been an honor.
All right. Well, see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.